Welcome to Plain Sight Docs. Thank you for joining us as we continue to uncover the truths hidden just beneath the surface, often concealed, not by elaborate conspiracies, but by the mundane realities of everyday life, sometimes literally under the ground beneath our feet. Tonight, we open a file carrying the heavy scent of chemical decay and broken promises. A story buried, not in remote deserts or back roads patrolled by corrupt lawmen, but beneath the swing sets and schoolyards of the post-war American dream. It's a narrative peeling back the cheerful facade of suburban progress to reveal a foundation built not on rock, but on poison. This is a story about a place built on a promise: affordable homes, good schools, safe streets. A promise whispered by industry and amplified by civic leaders. A promise delivered, however, by a powerful chemical corporation that smiled, offered contaminated land for a pittance, and hid a monstrous toxic secret directly in plain sight. We embark on a deep investigation into the chilling true story of Love Canal, a name now synonymous with environmental disaster. But before it was a headline, before it became a Superfund site, it was home. A working-class neighborhood that trusted the institutions meant to protect them. We uncover how the Hooker Electrochemical Company knowingly used an abandoned canal to dump 21,800 tons of deadly toxic waste, containing carcinogens like dioxin and benzene, and how, aware of the danger, they sold that poisoned land to a school board for just $1, washing their hands of responsibility. We'll document how, for decades, the company and government agencies engaged in denial and delay, dismissing resident complaints while children played in lethally contaminated playgrounds and families breathed poisoned air seeping into their homes. The insidious nature of the contamination meant that the danger wasn't always obvious. It was a slow creep, an invisible threat woven into the very fabric of their daily existence, making the eventual awakening even more traumatic. This isn't just a story of corporate greed, though that element is undeniable and central. It's a story of profound betrayal, met with equally profound defiance. A story of ordinary people, thrust into extraordinary circumstances, led by initially unassuming housewives like the determined Lois Gibbs, who refused to accept the official narrative and fought back against a seemingly insurmountable cover-up that directly threatened their children's lives and futures. It's an investigation into a crime of negligence and secrecy, where the ultimate weapon wasn't conventional, but environmental, the very ground beneath their feet turned against them by industrial indifference. Join us as we dig deep into the toxic secrets, the scientific battles, the political maneuvering, and the enduring human cost. Buried beneath the tragically misnamed playground called Love Canal, towering over this dynamic industrial landscape, both physically dominating the skyline with its massive plant and economically dictating the city's fortunes through employment and taxes, was the formidable Hooker Electrochemical Company. Established earlier in the 20th century, Hooker had strategically leveraged Niagara's abundant and exceptionally cheap hydroelectric power, a critical input for energy-intensive electrochemical processes, to grow exponentially into a chemical behemoth. It became a major national and international player, producing a vast, diverse, and often highly hazardous array of compounds absolutely essential to modern industrial processes and the exploding post-war consumer economy. Their sprawling Niagara Falls factories, operating around the clock with multiple shifts, churned out foundational industrial chemicals like elemental chlorine and caustic soda. They were early pioneers and major producers in the development and mass production of thermosetting plastics like bakelite, revolutionary materials transforming product design across industries. Critically, they also manufactured powerful, widely used, and environmentally persistent pesticides, including the infamous DDT and the highly toxic chlorinated hydrocarbon Mirex, both hailed at the time as agricultural miracles essential for boosting food production, but later recognized as ecological disasters. Additionally, Hooker produced a host of crucial industrial solvents, chemical intermediates used in synthesizing other products, and various specialty chemicals, many involving complex and dangerous chlorine chemistry. Hooker wasn't just a significant company operating within Niagara Falls for all practical purposes. It was the defining economic engine of the city. It directly employed thousands of local residents, often multiple members of the same families across several generations, creating deep community ties and dependencies. Its operations indirectly supported countless other ancillary businesses, suppliers of raw materials, transportation companies moving products, local merchants serving the workforce. The substantial taxes paid annually by Hooker constituted a significant portion of the municipal budget, directly funding the city's schools, roads, police, fire departments, and other public services. Consequently, the company naturally wielded immense, often unchallenged, political and economic influence within the region, fostering close relationships with local politicians and civic leaders. Hooker actively, and quite successfully, cultivated a public image of responsible corporate citizenship and paternalistic benevolence towards its workforce and the community, frequently sponsoring local events, contributing visibly to civic projects, and consistently presenting itself as the indispensable, benevolent engine driving Niagara Falls' growth, prosperity, and place in modern America. But this intensive chemical alchemy, this profitable transformation of basic raw materials like salt brine into the complex, often dangerous building blocks of modern industrial society, inevitably, inexorably generated a dark, hazardous byproduct, massive quantities of industrial waste. And crucially, this wasn't merely ordinary, inert industrial refuse like scrap metal or packaging. It consisted largely of highly toxic, chemically complex, environmentally persistent hazardous materials, leftover chemical sludge from reaction vessels, contaminated distillation residues, containing unreacted precursors and unwanted byproducts, off-specification, batches of products deemed unusable, toxic filter cakes, saturated with heavy metals used as catalysts, and various discarded materials contaminated during the manufacturing processes. The very chemical reactions designed to create Hooker's valuable marketable products, simultaneously, almost as a mirror image, left behind drums upon drums filled with substances whose specific chemical names now constitute a veritable registry of environmental and human health nightmares, recognized carcinogens, mutagens, and teratogens. We're talking about significant quantities of dioxin, specifically the supertoxic isomer TCDD, generated as an unwanted trace but highly potent contaminant during the manufacture of certain chlorinated phenols, like trichlorophenol, a substance Hooker produced in large volumes, later infamous as a key component, along with its contaminant dioxin, in the defoliant agent orange. Dioxin was recognized even then in specialized scientific circles, primarily through industrial accident reports and animal studies, as one of the most acutely toxic synthetic chemicals ever created by humankind. A potent carcinogen, a known disruptor of the immune and endocrine systems, and a teratogen capable of causing severe, horrific birth defects, even at vanishingly small, almost undetectable parts per trillion concentrations. The waste stream also included large volumes of benzene, a common industrial solvent and essential chemical building block derived from petroleum, already definitively known and regulated in occupational settings. In the 1940s, through numerous epidemiological studies, to be a potent human carcinogen strongly linked to the development of leukemia and other life-threatening blood disorders, like aplastic anemia. Add to this significant quantities of chloroform and trichlorophyllene, both widely used industrial solvents for degreasing and chemical synthesis, known at the time to cause significant liver and kidney damage with prolonged exposure, neurological effects like dizziness and anesthesia, and already strongly suspected, based on animal data, of being potential human carcinogens. Further complicating the mix were polychlorinated biphenyls, exceptionally stable, fire-resistant industrial fluids widely used in electrical transformers and capacitors, compounds whose extreme environmental persistence, tendency to bioaccumulate up the food chain, and potential long-term toxicity were beginning to raise serious concerns among scientists, even before their eventual widespread ban decades later. And this is just a partial list. The dump contained a nightmarish, largely uncatalogued chemical cocktail including other volatile organic compounds, like toluene and xylene, acidic and caustic sludges from various reaction processes, residues containing heavy metal contaminants like mercury, noxious pesticides such as lindane, and the notorious C56, along with countless other chlorinated hydrocarbons, phenols, and sulfur compounds, whose specific identities, quantities, and synergistic toxic effects remain incompletely understood even today, but whose devastating long-term health consequences were beginning to be tragically documented through grim case studies of worker exposures within the chemical manufacturing industry itself. Hooker Chemical, like virtually all heavy industries operating in its era, existed within a landscape largely devoid of meaningful federal or even state environmental regulation regarding hazardous waste disposal. The Environmental Protection Agency wouldn't be created until 1970. Comprehensive laws like the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, governing cradle-to-grave management of hazardous waste, wouldn't arrive until 1976. In the 1940s and 50s, the standard, accepted practice for disposing of industrial chemical waste was overwhelmingly crude landfilling, often in unlined pits, abandoned quarries, swamps, or any convenient depression in the earth, driven primarily by minimizing immediate cost, rather than ensuring long-term environmental safety or public health protection. Finding suitable, relatively secure, and politically acceptable locations for these industrial dump sites was an ongoing pressing challenge for companies like Hooker, generating massive volumes of hazardous material daily, and then, conveniently situated within the expanding eastern boundaries of the city of Niagara Falls, they identified what must have seemed, from a purely logistical and economic perspective, the perfect, almost divinely provided, low-cost solution: an oddly shaped, partially excavated, water-filled, abandoned canal project known locally as Love Canal. This wasn't just any roadside ditch. It represented the substantial waterlogged remnant of an ambitious, ultimately failed, late 19th century dream, conceived by a visionary, but perhaps financially overextended, Gilded Age entrepreneur named William T. Love. Love had envisioned creating a sprawling, futuristic model city, a perfectly planned industrial and residential community, powered entirely by clean, cheap hydroelectricity generated from a short, navigable power canal, designed to strategically bypass the formidable drop of Niagara Falls, connecting the upper and lower Niagara rivers above and below the cataract. He began the massive, arduous excavation work for the primary canal trench in the 1890s, successfully digging a significant, impressive section, approximately 3,000 feet in length, varying in width up to 80 feet, and reaching depths between 10 and 40 feet, before a devastating combination of factors derailed his grand vision. Severe economic downturns, particularly the nationwide panic of 1893, which dried up investment capital, coupled crucially with Nikola Tesla's competing, concurrent development and successful demonstration of efficient, long-distance alternating current electrical transmission technology, rendered Love's localized, direct current Midas-based power generation scheme effectively obsolete and financially non-viable almost overnight. The hugely ambitious Model City project was abruptly abandoned mid-construction, leaving behind, among other remnants, the large, partially dug, water-filled clay-lined trench, a deep, rectangular scar upon the landscape, largely forgotten by the burgeoning industrial city growing rapidly around it over the ensuing decades. Critically, beyond its convenient size, depth, and relative isolation at the time, Hooker began its search for a new dump site in the early 1940s. The specific geological characteristics of the abandoned Love Canal site made it particularly attractive to Hooker Chemicals engineers and managers evaluating potential hazardous waste repositories. Extensive geological surveys of the area, likely consulted by Hooker, revealed that this particular section of the canal had been excavated primarily through exceptionally thick, dense, naturally occurring layers of lacustrine clay soil, fine-grained sediments deposited by ancient glacial lakes. This type of clay possesses very low natural permeability, meaning liquids would, in theory, move through it extremely slowly. Hooker's engineers likely reasoned, based on the engineering knowledge of the day, that this substantial natural clay layer surrounding and underlying the canal trench could function as a rudimentary, essentially free natural containment vessel. It would, they likely believed, effectively prevent, or at least significantly retard the outward or downward migration of liquid chemical waste into the surrounding looser, more permeable soils, and more importantly, potentially safeguard the underlying groundwater aquifer from widespread contamination. Furthermore, the site was crucially situated in the early 1940s on what were then the relatively sparsely populated eastern outskirts of the city of Niagara Falls, geographically removed from immediate residential areas and less likely to attract sustained public scrutiny or troublesome complaints about odors or trucking activity. It seemed, from the purely pragmatic, cost-driven perspective of the company's waste disposal managers, an almost ideal confluence of factors: a large, conveniently pre-excavated void requiring minimal preparation, geology offering potential, if imperfect, natural containment, relative physical isolation minimizing immediate public nuisance, and presumably low acquisition or usage cost. An apparently perfect, readily available, out-of-sight, out-of-mind solution for their rapidly accumulating, highly problematic, and increasingly voluminous toxic industrial waste stream. Thus began the systematic, largely unscrutinized, decade-long transformation of William Love's failed 19th-century utopian dream into Hooker Chemicals' 20th-century toxic reality. Starting formally in 1942, during the heightened industrial production demands and perhaps reduced regulatory oversight accompanying World War II, and continuing relentlessly, day in and day out, through seasonal variations and economic cycles for over 10 crucial years, until landfilling operations finally ceased. Definitively in early 1953, Hooker Chemical methodically, routinely utilized the abandoned Love Canal ditch as its primary, officially sanctioned repository for a significant portion of its most hazardous chemical waste generated at the massive Niagara Falls complex. The process itself lacked almost any of the basic engineering safeguards, monitoring protocols, or environmental protections that would be considered remotely acceptable, let alone legal, by today's standards. Day after day, truckload after truckload, carrying Hooker's toxic cargo arrived at the site. A substantial portion of the waste, estimated by later studies to be over 60% by volume, was technically contained within standard 55-gallon metal drums. However, photographic evidence and eyewitness accounts confirm these drums were often already corroding significantly upon arrival, sometimes visibly damaged during transport or handling, and were simply lowered, rolled, or sometimes even dropped directly from trucks into the partially water-filled, muddy trench below. There was no segregation of incompatible wastes, no careful stacking, no system for tracking drum contents. Furthermore, significant quantities of hazardous waste, particularly liquid residues and semi-solid sludges from chemical reaction vessels or distillation processes, were disposed of in bulk, uncontainerized form. Tanker trucks reportedly backed up to the edge of the canal and simply pumped their noxious liquid contents directly into the trench, mixing freely with the existing water, soil, and previously dumped drummed waste. Solid chemical residues contaminated filter cakes from production processes, fly ash, and other miscellaneous hazardous debris were also dumped haphazardly, often used as intermediate cover material between layers of drums, creating a chaotic, heterogeneous, highly toxic subterranean landfill. The sheer volume officially documented is staggering, yet potentially represents an underestimate: 21,800 tons, nearly 44 million pounds, of mixed hazardous chemical waste. A complex and largely uncatalogued toxic brew, encompassing the dangerous substances previously mentioned, were poured, dumped, packed, and ultimately buried within the confines of the Love Canal Trench during this crucial 11-year operational period. Visualizing this quantity remains difficult. It represents enough highly toxic material to fill roughly 10 Olympic-sized swimming pools completely to the brim. Barrel after rusting, inevitably leaking metal barrel, containing some of the most dangerous, environmentally persistent, and biologically damaging chemical compounds produced by modern industry, were lowered unceremoniously into the earth, often punctured or crushed during the dumping process, covered over layer by layer with excavated clay soil and miscellaneous fill material lacking any engineered liner system, and then ostensibly, intended to be forgotten by the corporations solely responsible for their creation and perilous disposal. Critically, however, subsequent legal discovery processes during the extensive litigations of the late 1970s and 1980s, along with federal investigations conducted under the Superfund program, unearthed a damning, incontrovertible trail of internal Hooker Company documents, confidential corporate memoranda, internal engineering reports, assessing the dump site, risk assessment studies, evaluating potential long-term liabilities, inter-office correspondence between managers and legal counsel, proving conclusively and unequivocally that the company was not operating in ignorance regarding the potential hazards. High-level corporate officials, company chemists involved in production, and engineers responsible for waste management were acutely aware, even during the active dumping period from 1942 to 1953, of the significant potential long-term dangers associated with the specific types, the sheer volume, and the hazardous nature of the waste being systematically buried in the Love Canal site. Their own internal scientific assessments recognized the extreme toxicity and, crucially, the environmental persistence of many of the key chemical compounds involved, particularly the chlorinated hydrocarbons. Specific internal company memos, later entered as key evidence in court, explicitly discussed the potential for future harm should these chemicals ever escape the confines of the canal through predictable container failure, gradual leaching into surrounding groundwater, or subsequent physical disturbance of the capped site. They understood the basic science. They recognized the significant latent risks inherent in their chosen cost-driven disposal method, yet motivated primarily by the powerful drivers of economic expediency. Utilizing the Love Canal ditch for landfilling was demonstrably, significantly cheaper than exploring alternative, potentially safer disposal methods, like high-temperature incineration or chemical neutralization. Even those known and technically feasible at the time. They proceeded with the operation for over a decade. Upon finally ceasing dumping activities at Love Canal in early 1953, likely due to the site reaching its physical capacity and the city's encroachment making further operations untenable, Hooker undertook nominal, legally minimal steps to secure the site, according to the profoundly inadequate standards and near total lack of specific regulations governing hazardous waste disposal in that era. They ordered the remaining waste to be covered with several feet of additional excavated soil and locally sourced clay material, attempting to create a rudimentary cap intended primarily to prevent direct human contact with the underlying waste and, theoretically, to limit the amount of rainwater infiltration, which could accelerate the leaching of chemicals into the surrounding environment. They believed, or perhaps more accurately, legally postured for potential future defense by claiming belief that this relatively thin clay cap, combined with the site's perceived natural clay geological setting, would provide adequate, indefinite containment for the millions of pounds of entombed poisons. It was, viewed even through the lens of 1950s engineering standards, a profoundly inadequate containment strategy, lacking any impermeable liners, leachate collection systems, or long-term monitoring protocols. Viewed more cynically through the lens of subsequent events, it represented a monumental multi-generational gamble taken against the future health and safety of the surrounding community, a toxic legacy deliberately buried, legally disavowed through the subsequent land sale, and effectively abandoned. And then, almost immediately after completing these minimal closure steps, barely allowing the freshly graded soil time to settle over the massive chemical grave they had created. Hooker Chemical made a fateful, almost incomprehensible decision, a decision driven perhaps by a shrewd, calculated desire to legally divest themselves as quickly as possible of a property they internally recognized as a significant potential long-term liability. Perhaps by genuine corporate underestimation of the true catastrophic long-term risks involved despite their internal warnings, or perhaps simply by pragmatic corporate expediency in the face of persistent civic pressure from the Niagara Falls School Board. The post-war baby boom was fueling explosive suburban growth across America, and Niagara Falls was experiencing intense pressure to expand its infrastructure, particularly its school system. The city was rapidly sprawling eastward, its new residential developments inexorably encroaching upon the once relatively isolated industrial periphery where the now covered, seemingly vacant Love Canal site lay. The local public authority, the Niagara Falls Board of Education, found itself facing intense, unrelenting pressure from a rapidly growing population, demanding new neighborhood schools to accommodate the influx of young families. Affordable, suitably sized, and conveniently located parcels of land within the rapidly developing eastern city limits were becoming increasingly scarce and expensive. The seemingly unused, relatively level, 16-acre rectangular parcel of land still owned by Hooker Chemical, the land sitting directly atop the recently capped Love Canal chemical landfill, appeared, at least superficially on city planning maps, to be an ideal, strategically situated location for a desperately needed new elementary school and associated community recreational fields. The historical record, meticulously reconstructed through subsequent legal proceedings, and including meeting minutes from both the school board and Hooker Chemical's board of directors, clearly documents the ensuing interactions. The Niagara Falls Board of Education formally approached Hooker Chemical sometime in 1952 or early 1953, explicitly stating their strong desire to acquire the specific Love Canal property for the express purpose of constructing a new public elementary school to serve the burgeoning adjacent neighborhoods. Hooker Chemical's initial documented reaction, consistent with their internal awareness of the site's hazardous nature, was one of significant resistance and explicit formal warning. Company representatives, on multiple documented occasions, including formal meetings and written correspondence, explicitly cautioned the school board against building anything, especially a school, on that specific site. They disclosed, albeit perhaps not with the alarming level of scientific detail or urgent emphasis that true transparency and ethical responsibility would have demanded, the indisputable presence of significant quantities of buried chemical waste directly beneath the surface, referencing their past decade-long industrial use of the land as a disposal site. Internal Hooker documents from the period reveal considerable corporate discussion regarding the potential dangers and the wisdom of allowing construction. They strongly, repeatedly advised the school board representatives that the land was fundamentally unsuitable for any construction involving excavation or intended for public use, particularly emphasizing the risks associated with building a school where hundreds of young children would be present daily, potentially digging in the soil, playing directly on the grounds above the waste. However, the school board, facing intense, unrelenting public and political pressure to build new schools quickly to alleviate overcrowding, and finding themselves severely constrained by limited municipal budgets, and a scarcity of alternative, readily available sites in the rapidly developing area persisted with remarkable, ultimately tragic, tenacity. According to some historical accounts, and later testimonies from individuals involved, they reportedly downplayed, dismissed, or perhaps simply failed to fully comprehend the gravity of hookers' technical warnings regarding the chemical waste. Perhaps they tragically underestimated the true nature, the sheer volume, or the potential long-term migratory behavior of the buried waste materials. Perhaps they suspected the company was deliberately exaggerating the risks, merely to avoid selling the strategically located land cheaply, or to evade potential future cleanup responsibilities. Or perhaps, operating under the vastly different environmental awareness standards and prevailing assumptions of the early 1950s, where industrial progress often overshadowed vague environmental concerns, they simply prioritized the immediate, tangible, politically popular need for a new school over poorly understood, seemingly distant, hypothetical long-term risks associated with invisible chemicals buried underground. Some accounts even suggest, though definitive proof remains elusive, that the board implicitly, or perhaps even explicitly threatened to invoke the powerful government. For nearly 2 decades following the construction of the 99th Street School and the surrounding residential neighborhood in the mid-1950s, life in Love Canal largely mirrored the aspirations, and perhaps the willful blindness, of post-war suburban America. It was, by most outward appearances, marketed and perceived as a stable, affordable, working-class paradise. Families moved in by the hundreds, attracted primarily by the readily available, relatively inexpensive new housing stock, the undeniable convenience of the brand new elementary school, located literally within walking distance for many, and the pervasive promise of a safe, family-friendly environment to raise their children. This promise was implicitly underwritten by the proximity to relatively well-paying industrial jobs in Niagara Falls, many, ironically, provided directly or indirectly by the activities of the Hooker Electrochemical Company itself, creating a complex cycle of economic dependence. The community, populated largely by young families, often starting out, quickly developed a strong, tightly knit, almost insular social fabric. Neighbors knew each other not just by name, but often by family history and workplace connections. Children played together freely and largely unsupervised, roaming the seemingly benign landscape of newly sodded lawns, freshly paved streets, backyard swing sets, and most significantly, the large, inviting, ostensibly vacant open field, grassy and sometimes marshy, that innocuously covered the former canal bed, serving as an unofficial community park and playground. Backyard barbecues in the summer, boisterous block parties celebrating holidays, fiercely competitive Little League games played on nearby fields, all the familiar rhythms and rituals of mid-century American suburban life, played out daily against a physical backdrop that residents assumed, without question, to be ordinary, safe, unremarkable. People diligently planted vegetable gardens in their small backyards, implicitly trusting the dark, rich-looking soil to yield healthy, nourishing produce for their families. They invested precious savings and countless hours of sweat equity in finishing their previously unfinished basements, transforming the damp subterranean spaces into much-needed extra living areas, rec rooms for teenage gatherings, playrooms for younger children, sometimes even additional bedrooms to accommodate growing families, digging deeper, unknowingly, into the contaminated earth they believed was stable and safe. Some residents, achieving a measure of modest prosperity, even installed in-ground swimming pools in their backyards, further disturbing the shallow soil layers mere yards away from the buried chemical waste, creating potential conduits for contamination. Life, for the most part, felt reassuringly normal, predictably secure, firmly anchored in the comforting familiar routines of family, work, and community. Yet even during these seemingly placid paradise years, subtle, disquieting anomalies occasionally, persistently punctured the smooth veneer of suburban normalcy. These weren't typically dramatic, headline-grabbing events that demanded immediate explanation. Rather, they manifested as strange, often isolated, easily rationalized occurrences. Odd smells, peculiar seepages, unexplained illnesses, which in retrospect served as increasingly urgent, though largely unheeded, ominous foreshadowing of the catastrophic environmental disaster brewing silently, relentlessly beneath the surface. Persistent, unusual, often noxious odors were perhaps the most frequently reported, yet most easily dismissed. Anomaly, particularly noticeable during the hot, humid summer months, or immediately following periods of heavy rainfall or rapid snowmelt which saturated the ground. Residents frequently described intermittent chemical smells, sometimes sharp, pungent, and acrid, like industrial solvents or cleaning agents, sometimes strangely sweet, cloying, almost fruity, wafting unpredictably through the neighborhood. These odors were often strongest, residents noted, near the 99th Street school field, in low-lying drainage ditches, or emanating directly from their own basement sump pumps. However, living in a heavily industrialized city like Niagara Falls, characterized by numerous active chemical plants and manufacturing facilities, most residents simply grew accustomed to such industrial effluvia. They rationalized these smells as an unavoidable byproduct of economic progress, perhaps venting from a nearby factory, the unfortunate but acceptable smell of money, the unavoidable olfactory signature of the industries providing their livelihoods. Few, if any, made the specific terrifying connection between these transient unpleasant odors and the specific ground directly beneath their own neighborhood, beneath their own homes. More tangibly disturbing, and harder to ignore completely, were the periodic, increasingly frequent seepages of strange substances into homes and yards. Especially after prolonged rains or significant spring thaws that dramatically raised the local groundwater table, some homeowners, particularly those whose properties directly bordered the indistinct boundaries of the former canal landfill, or whose lots happened to lie along suspected natural underground drainage paths, would discover bizarre, oily, viscous black, or sometimes multicolored sludge, inexplicably oozing up through cracks in their concrete basement floors, bubbling near sump pump discharges in their yards, or most alarmingly, actively seeping through cinder block basement walls, leaving greasy stains and potent chemical stenches. This intrusive viscous material often possessed a strong, nauseating chemical odor, distinct from typical basement dampness, and could cause immediate skin irritation or even chemical burns upon direct contact. Again, however, common, reassuring explanations often prevailed in conversations among neighbors. Perhaps it was just naturally occurring swamp water or muck, due to the area's notoriously low elevation and historically high water table. Maybe it represented residual oils or tars washed off from nearby roads or leaching from old railroad beds. The truly horrifying idea that it might be concentrated, toxic chemical waste migrating directly upwards from a massive buried dump just yards away seemed too alarming, too improbable, too fundamentally disruptive to their entire sense of security to seriously entertain without definitive proof. Anecdotal evidence of localized environmental stress also steadily accumulated throughout the 1960s and early 70s. Though typically dismissed as isolated misfortunes or blamed on unrelated factors. Home gardeners frequently complained amongst themselves about strangely stunted vegetable growth, plants inexplicably withering and dying in specific patches of otherwise fertile-looking soil, or yielding produce with odd tastes or textures. Established trees in certain areas, particularly mature specimens growing near the canal boundary, exhibited unusual patterns of premature leaf loss, branch dieback, or sudden, inexplicable death, often attributed vaguely to blight or harsh winters. Families living closest to the canal sometimes noted, with unease, what seemed like an unsettlingly high frequency of unusual illnesses, tumors, or premature deaths among their household pets. Cats, dogs, birds, attributing these sad events perhaps to common animal diseases, poor breeding, or simply bad luck, rather than connecting them to potential chronic exposure to environmental toxins shared with their human companions. More direct, though often tragically misinterpreted or downplayed at the time, were recurring incidents involving the numerous children who treated the neighborhood, particularly the large vacant field covering the canal cap and the grounds of the 99th Street School, as their primary playground. Scattered but persistent reports surfaced over the years of children developing unusual, painful, persistent skin rashes, sometimes clinically diagnosed as chloroquine, or suffering blister-like chemical burns, particularly on their bare feet and lower legs after playing in stagnant puddles or digging in damp soil within the field area. Perhaps even more alarming were the documented instances where small, inexplicable fires or patches of continuously smoldering earth would occasionally erupt spontaneously on the school playground, especially during hot, dry weather. Sometimes these hot spots would reportedly ignite with a startling pop when children inadvertently threw rocks onto them, exposing pockets of highly volatile chemical residues, possibly phosphorus-based compounds known to have been dumped by Hooker, buried just inches beneath the surface. These genuinely hazardous incidents, incredibly, were typically attributed by school officials and sometimes even parents to mundane causes. Children carelessly playing with matches or discarded cigarettes, naturally occurring swamp gas ignition, rather than being recognized as terrifyingly direct signals of the toxic landfill's failing containment and the immediate danger it posed to the children playing directly upon it. Each strange, pervasive chemical smell, each invasive basement seepage, each inexplicably sick pet, each mysterious childhood rash or burn, each smoldering patch on the playground, was consistently viewed, rationalized, and ultimately dismissed in isolation. It was perceived as a minor anomaly, an unfortunate quirk, a localized nuisance within an otherwise normal functioning suburban existence. There was as yet no established framework, no collective awareness, no critical mass of shared information or suspicion to connect these disparate, individually disturbing dots into the comprehensive, horrifying picture they truly represented when viewed collectively. The chemical wolf, sleeping fitfully, stirring restlessly beneath their feet, occasionally bared its toxic teeth, but its pervasive, insidious presence remained largely unacknowledged, effectively hidden by denial, normalization, and lack of information, hidden paradoxically in plain sight. The crucial catalyst for change. The series of events that finally began to systematically unravel the decades of denial, normalization, and misplaced trust, arrived not as a single, sudden, explosive revelation, but rather as a slow, dawning, terrifying collective realization. This awakening was driven primarily by two converging forces in the mid to late 1970s. First, a demonstrable escalation in the frequency and severity of the environmental problems plaguing the neighborhood, coinciding climatologically with a period of unusually heavy rainfall and record-breaking snowfall that significantly, persistently raised the local groundwater table, effectively saturating the landfill and increasing the hydraulic pressure driving chemical migration outwards and upwards. And second, the concurrent publication of a series of persistent probing articles in the local newspaper, the Niagara Gazette, spearheaded by two tenacious investigative reporters, David Polak and David Russell, prompted initially by the increasing volume of resident complaints about odors and basement issues, and perhaps fueled by long-circulating rumors within the city regarding the canal's history. Polak and Russell began diligently digging into the largely forgotten history of the Love Canal site. They meticulously uncovered the details of Hooker Chemical's extensive dumping activities decades earlier, documented the controversial circumstances surrounding the nominal $1 land sale to the school board, and began connecting these historical facts to the contemporary resident complaints and emerging health concerns. Their articles, initially cautious and focused primarily on historical context and property disputes, gradually grew bolder, more accusatory, as they documented the escalating resident complaints, mapped the patterns of reported problems, and explicitly began to suggest potential causal links between the buried chemical waste and the strange environmental phenomena and alarming health issues increasingly plaguing the neighborhood. While not yet definitively proving scientific causation, a notoriously difficult task in environmental epidemiology, their persistent high-profile reporting provided a crucial legitimate public forum for residents' long-suppressed concerns, validated their experiences, and began to significantly chip away at the complacent official narrative that everything in Love Canal was essentially normal, safe, and under control. It was precisely within this charged context, characterized by escalating, undeniable environmental problems intruding directly into homes, coupled with emerging, validating media scrutiny challenging official complacency, that Lois Marie Gibbs, then a relatively typical 27-year-old housewife and mother residing with her family on 101st Street, embarked upon her fateful personal investigation. Her initial motivation wasn't abstract environmentalism or political activism. It was direct, visceral, and intensely personal. The persistent, baffling, and increasingly severe complex of health problems afflicting her young son Michael. Michael had eagerly enrolled in kindergarten at the seemingly modern, conveniently located 99th Street Elementary School in September of 1977. Almost immediately upon starting school, his health, previously unremarkable, began a frightening downward spiral. He developed chronic, debilitating asthma requiring frequent emergency room visits and hospitalizations. He began experiencing epileptic seizures, a terrifying neurological condition previously absent. He suffered from persistent, difficult-to-treat urinary tract disorders and exhibited abnormal liver function tests. Furthermore, blood tests revealed a drastically, alarmingly lowered white blood cell count, indicating potential severe compromise of his developing immune system. His pediatrician and various specialists were perplexed, unable to pinpoint a clear underlying cause or effective treatment for his rapidly accumulating, debilitating array of serious medical symptoms. Lois Gibbs, a naturally meticulous and increasingly desperate mother searching for answers, avidly read the ongoing Niagara Gazette articles in the spring of 1978. She paid particular attention to the reports that specifically mentioned the massive Hooker chemical dump site located directly adjacent to and partially buried beneath her son's elementary school. Suddenly, terrifyingly, the disparate pieces began to click into place in her mind. Could this forgotten industrial graveyard, this buried legacy of Hooker Chemical's past activities, be the hidden, insidious source of Michael's mysterious multi-system suffering? Could the school building itself, the playground where he spent hours each day, the very air he breathed within its walls, be actively poisoning him and perhaps hundreds of other children? The possibility was almost too horrifying to contemplate, yet it offered a potential unifying explanation where conventional medicine had consistently failed to provide answers. Driven by a potent combination of fierce maternal instinct and growing suspicion, Lois's first, seemingly reasonable and bureaucratically conventional step was to formally request that the Niagara Falls School Board allow her son Michael to transfer immediately to another public elementary school, located further away from the suspect Love Canal site. She explicitly cited her mounting concerns about potential chronic chemical exposure at the 99th Street School, grounding her request in the documented history reported by the local newspaper. The school board's response to this individual parental request was not merely unhelpful or procedurally delayed. It was perceived by Lois Gibbs as shockingly dismissive, patronizingly condescending, and ultimately profoundly galvanizing. They summarily, flatly refused her transfer request without significant deliberation. Board officials, echoing the minimizing narratives often provided by the city and perhaps influenced by decades of Hooker's local dominance, insisted there existed no credible scientific evidence whatsoever of any actual health hazard present at the school or in the surrounding neighborhood. They defensively referenced Hooker Chemical's nominal cleanup efforts decades prior, and significantly pointed to the infamous $1 deeds liability clause as proof that any potential problem was legally the school board's responsibility, not Hooker's. While simultaneously denying any actual problem existed, they implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, questioned Lois Gibbs's motives, her scientific understanding of the complex issues involved, and her emotional stability. They strongly suggested in effect that she was simply overreacting, perhaps seeking attention or special treatment. They essentially told her, a terrified mother, seeking only the basic protection of her seriously ill child from a suspected environmental threat, that her deeply felt concerns were unfounded, her maternal fears irrational. They infamously, dismissively labeled her, in words that would soon echo ironically across national headlines, as just another hysterical housewife. That callous, bureaucratic stonewalling, that dismissive minimization of her legitimate concerns in the face of her child's tangible suffering, did not crush or silence Lois Gibbs. Instead, it ignited a profound, transformative fire within her. The gnawing fear for her son's immediate health and long-term future instantly transmuted into a burning, righteous, unyielding anger. An anger directed squarely at the perceived indifference and incompetence of the system, the elected and appointed officials who seemed determined to ignore, deny, and potentially sacrifice the well-being of their community's children, rather than confront an inconvenient and potentially expensive truth. If the designated officials wouldn't listen, if the established institutions meant to protect public health actively chose denial over due diligence, then the people themselves, the residents directly impacted, would have no choice but to organize, to investigate independently, to raise their collective voice, and to force those in power, through sustained pressure, to finally confront the horrific reality unfolding in Love Canal. Gibbs, despite later describing herself in numerous interviews as having been incredibly shy, politically naive, and possessing absolutely no prior experience whatsoever in community organizing, public speaking, or political activism before the Love Canal crisis erupted, began a process that would rapidly, unexpectedly transform her into a nationally recognized, highly effective environmental leader. Her initial step remained remarkably simple, direct, and grounded in traditional civic action. Armed with newfound resolve, she hand-drew a straightforward petition, demanding the immediate, precautionary closure of the 99th Street Elementary School, pending a thorough, independent, scientific investigation into potential health risks. Then, deliberately overcoming her natural reticence and fear of public engagement, she began the arduous, unglamorous work of knocking on doors throughout her immediate neighborhood. Initially just seeking signatures from fellow concerned parents who might share her anxieties about the school's proximity to the dump. What she encountered, however, as she moved methodically from house to house, street by street, listening patiently to the stories shared on front porches and in living rooms, rapidly broadened her focus far beyond the school grounds and solidified her most horrifying suspicions about the true, pervasive nature of the crisis. The personal stories poured out, often hesitantly at first, then with increasing urgency, a torrent of suppressed fear, accumulated grief, inexplicable illness, and simmering anger directed at years of official neglect. It wasn't just her son Michael who was suffering from bizarre, unexplained health problems. Neighbor after neighbor, often relieved to find someone finally willing to listen and connect the dots, recounted eerily, heartbreakingly similar tales. Other children in the neighborhood suffering from unusually high rates of chronic asthma, debilitating epilepsy, persistent infections requiring constant antibiotic treatment, bizarre and painful skin conditions. Women spoke, often in hushed, tearful tones, of experiencing repeated devastating miscarriages, stillbirths, or giving birth to babies afflicted with alarming, sometimes multiple, congenital birth defects, cleft palates, club feet, extra digits, serious heart murmurs, cognitive impairments, intellectual disabilities. Families shared stories of unusually aggressive or rare cancers striking seemingly healthy young adults, of persistent, debilitating respiratory problems, afflicting entire households, of bizarre neurological disorders, appearing in troubling clusters that seemed to defy statistical probability. And almost universally, residents complained bitterly about the persistent, nauseating chemical odors that permeated the neighborhood, especially after rain, and recounted their frustrating, often futile battles with the strange, corrosive substances inexplicably leaching into their basements, damaging property, and filling their homes with unbearable, potentially hazardous fumes. Realizing the potential scope of the unfolding public health catastrophe extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of the school grounds, Lois Gibbs made a crucial intuitive leap. She purchased a large, detailed street map of the entire Love Canal neighborhood. As she continued her relentless door-to-door canvassing, collecting not just signatures but detailed health histories and accounts of environmental problems, she began meticulously, systematically placing colored pins on the map. Each pin represented a reported instance of a specific, serious health issue, perhaps a red pin for a confirmed cancer diagnosis, blue for a documented birth defect, green for a reported miscarriage, yellow for epilepsy or another neurological disorder, black for basement seepage or severe odors, and so on. As the pins steadily accumulated over weeks of painstaking effort, a terrifying, visually undeniable geographic pattern began to emerge starkly on the map. The reported illnesses weren't randomly scattered throughout the neighborhood, as one might expect from typical background rates of disease. Instead, they were heavily, disproportionately clustered, forming distinct geographical concentrations. These clusters appeared most intensely along the historical footprint of the buried canal itself, confirming the initial suspicion. But crucially, significant clusters also radiated outwards from the canal along specific, identifiable linear pathways that astute residents and later geological experts would definitively identify as corresponding precisely to the paths of the old buried swales. These swales, essentially geological ghosts lurking beneath the suburban landscape, represented the natural, meandering pathways of old creek beds and surface water drainage channels that had traversed the area before William Love ever excavated his canal trench, and long before Hooker Chemical subsequently filled it with millions of pounds of toxic waste. They represented zones of looser, more permeable soil and gravel within the otherwise dense, relatively impermeable clay geology typical of the region. They were, in effect, pre-existing subterranean drainage routes. When Hooker filled the canal, they did so haphazardly, without properly surveying, lining, or engineering the site to specifically account for or intercept these natural underground drainage conduits. Consequently, as the thousands of buried metal drums inevitably corroded over time and began to leak their highly toxic chemical contents, and as decades of rainwater and snowmelt continuously infiltrated the landfill, percolating downwards through the waste mass, the resulting chemical leachate, a poisonous liquid soup containing dissolved industrial solvents, pesticides, dioxins, and other hazardous materials, didn't just remain passively contained within the original boundaries of the canal ditch, as Hooker had perhaps hoped or assumed. Instead, it preferentially migrated outwards, actively following the paths of least resistance, traveling laterally along these more permeable buried swales, like toxic underground highways. These swales acted as direct conduits, carrying dissolved chemical poisons silently, invisibly, directly into the surrounding soil, under the concrete foundations of homes, and ultimately seeping upwards into the basements and yards of residences, located blocks away from the visible, marked footprint of the original canal landfill itself. The dramatically clustered patterns of colored pins on Lois Gibbs's meticulously assembled map, concentrated unnervingly along these precise swale lines, provided powerful, visually compelling, grassroots epidemiological evidence. This evidence directly, forcefully contradicted the emerging official narrative, often echoed by Hooker Occidental representatives, that any potential contamination problem, if one existed at all, was strictly confined only to those properties immediately adjacent to the former canal boundary. This wasn't, Gibbs argued passionately, mere random chance. It wasn't collective psychosomatic illness or mass hysterias as some critics began to suggest. This was, she became utterly convinced, irrefutable evidence of direct cause and effect, a clear, demonstrable correlation between geographical proximity to the buried chemical waste, particularly along these newly identified migration pathways, and catastrophic, multi-generational human health outcomes. Lois Gibbs, the supposedly hysterical housewife, armed initially only with a street map, colored pins, boundless determination, and her neighbors' tragically numerous painful stories, had effectively conducted her own preliminary, yet devastatingly revealing, community health survey and environmental mapping project. She had reached scientifically plausible, deeply alarming conclusions that credentialed government agencies, hampered by bureaucratic caution, political considerations, or perhaps insufficient resources, had, up to that crucial point in the summer of 1978, utterly failed or actively refused to acknowledge publicly. Galvanized by these stark, visually undeniable findings, by the sheer number of demonstrably affected families identified through her canvassing, and fueled by a growing sense of outrage at the official inaction and dismissive attitudes they encountered, Lois Gibbs and a core group of equally concerned, newly activated neighbors formally organized themselves in early August 1978. They officially established the Love Canal Homeowners Association, filing the necessary paperwork to become a recognized community organization. This entity, however, wasn't conceived as, nor did it ever function like, a typical passive neighborhood association focused primarily on mundane issues like zoning variances or organizing block parties. From its very inception, born directly out of a shared, escalating public health crisis, the LCHA operated as a highly focused, strategically minded, and increasingly militant activist organization. It was in effect a crisis committee, forged in the crucible of shared desperation and united by a singular, urgent, non-negotiable goal to force the government, at all necessary levels, to finally acknowledge the full, true extent of the pervasive chemical contamination throughout the entire Love Canal neighborhood, and consequently, to take immediate, comprehensive action to protect the health and safety of all affected residents, not just a conveniently selected, geographically limited few. Lois Gibbs, the initially shy, politically inexperienced mother, who had simply wanted to transfer her sick son out of a potentially dangerous school building just months earlier, found herself, largely by default, propelled by her own relentless drive, her emerging organizational skills, and the desperate trust placed in her by her neighbors, elected as the LCHA's first, and ultimately defining, president. Their initial operational headquarters wasn't a rented storefront or a formal office space. It was Lois Gibbs's own small, increasingly crowded suburban living room on 101st Street. Their primary operational tools in those early days weren't sophisticated databases, professional lobbyists, or high-powered legal teams. They were decidedly low-tech yet surprisingly effective instruments of grassroots power, rotary dial telephones used relentlessly, day and night, to contact reporters, badger politicians, and coordinate neighborhood actions. Stacks upon stacks of petitions circulated tirelessly, door to door, gathering thousands of signatures. Donated, often bulky mimeograph machines, located in basements, churning out urgent newsletters, informative flyers, and protest announcements late into the night, and most powerfully, the undeniable, compelling, increasingly amplified human truth of their collection. On August 2nd, 1978, acknowledging a great and imminent peril lurking beneath Love Canal, served as a pivotal double-edged sword for the besieged community. After months, arguably years of enduring dismissive platitudes, bureaucratic runarounds, and condescending labels, branding them as hysterical, unscientific, or simply opportunistic, the residents, particularly the core activists within the Love Canal Homeowners Association led by Lois Gibbs, felt a profound, albeit deeply unsettling, sense of validation. The state of New York, operating through its highest-ranking public health official, had finally conceded, unequivocally, and on the public record, that a serious, dangerous, and immediate public health emergency existed within their neighborhood. Furthermore, this emergency was explicitly, officially linked, however cautiously worded, to the massive quantities of chemical waste buried beneath their homes and the adjacent 99th Street School. Their persistent, agonizing fears weren't merely irrational paranoia generated by strange smells and anecdotal illnesses. The threat was demonstrably real, scientifically confirmed at least in part by the state's own alarming air sampling data, which revealed dangerously high concentrations of known carcinogens like benzene, actively infiltrating the living spaces where families slept and children played. The immediate, unambiguous recommendation to permanently close the 99th Street Elementary School felt like a particularly hard-won, tangible victory, especially for Lois Gibbs, whose entire personal crusade had initially begun with precisely that singular, focused goal, driven solely by the mysterious, debilitating illnesses plaguing her young son, Michael, a student at that very school. However, this fleeting, almost disorienting sense of having finally been heard, of their suffering being officially acknowledged, was almost instantaneously overshadowed, then completely eclipsed, by the profound inadequacy, the perceived callousness, and the inherently divisive nature of the state's proposed initial remedial action. Dr. Whalen's urgent evacuation recommendation, despite the declaration of imminent peril, extended only, quite specifically, to pregnant women and very young children, based on their recognized heightened vulnerability to toxic exposures. Even more critically, this recommendation applied only to those families residing within the arbitrarily defined first 2 rings of houses immediately adjacent to the physical boundaries of the former canal landfill itself. Concurrently, the state announced a still somewhat tentative plan, contingent on legislative funding approval, to offer to purchase the homes located only within these first 2 rings, encompassing approximately 239 specific, geographically contiguous properties. This action effectively condemned that narrowly defined inner zone as uninhabitable, while implicitly, devastatingly, declaring every other home, every other family residing just beyond this invisible line, essentially safe, or at least not sufficiently imperiled to warrant immediate state-funded rescue. The reaction within the broader Love Canal community, particularly among those residing just outside the designated buyout zone, was immediate, visceral, overwhelmingly negative, and unified in its outrage. While the families fortunate enough, if one could use that term, to live within the designated rings 1 and 2 were understandably relieved at the sudden prospect of potential escape, albeit simultaneously facing the daunting traumatic reality of forced displacement, uncertain financial futures, and lingering fears about their past exposures, the vast majority of Love Canal residents, the hundreds of families living just beyond this arbitrary line drawn on a state map, including crucially those situated along the LCHA-identified toxic swale pathways extending much further into the neighborhood, felt utterly, profoundly betrayed, abandoned, callously sacrificed, and frankly, terrified. The logic seemed incomprehensible, cruel even. How could the state simultaneously declare an imminent peril affecting the area, yet simultaneously draw a sharp, definitive line on a map, literally bisecting streets, and arbitrarily deem families residing on one side of that line worthy of immediate state-funded rescue, while effectively condemning those living just feet away, often in identical houses experiencing similar basement seepages and noxious odors, to remain indefinitely in homes they now had official reason to believe were dangerously contaminated? What scientific basis, residents demanded, justified this precise boundary? What about the LCHA's own meticulously compiled, comprehensive grassroots health survey, painstakingly documented pin by colored pin on Lois Gibbs's kitchen table map, which clearly showed alarming, statistically significant clusters of miscarriages, birth defects, cancers, and other serious illnesses extending far beyond these arbitrarily defined first 2 rings, particularly concentrating ominously along the suspected underground swale migration pathways? What about the hundreds of children over the age of 2, or the numerous adults already suffering from chronic debilitating illnesses potentially linked to chemical exposure, who happen to live just outside this conveniently drawn evacuation zone? Were their lives, their health, considered less valuable, less imperiled? The state's decision, likely based primarily on the limited initial basement air sampling conducted only in the innermost ring of homes immediately adjacent to the canal, and undoubtedly influenced heavily by a pragmatic, bureaucratic desire to contain the potentially astronomical financial costs associated with a larger-scale property buyout and resident relocation, created an immediate toxic and deeply damaging rift within the previously remarkably united Love Canal community. It cruelly, perhaps unintentionally but effectively, pitted neighbor against neighbor, shattering the social cohesion that had been essential to their initial organizing efforts. Those families designated for the state buyout felt a desperate, understandable urgency to finalize the process and escape the contaminated environment as quickly as possible, while simultaneously facing, in some instances, simmering resentment or even outright accusations from those left behind, accusations of somehow being unfairly chosen, of exaggerating their symptoms, or of abandoning the collective fight. Conversely, those residents living outside the designated two-ring zone felt profoundly trapped, holding mortgages on homes they now had official confirmation were likely contaminated by migrating toxic chemicals, homes whose property values had instantly, catastrophically plummeted to effectively zero overnight, homes they couldn't possibly sell on the open market, couldn't afford to simply walk away from, yet simultaneously felt, with growing certainty and terror, were actively, continuously poisoning their families with every breath taken, every glass of water drunk, every vegetable harvested from their backyard gardens. The psychological stress generated by this impossible situation, trapped between financial ruin and perceived physical danger, was immense, pervasive, manifesting daily as crushing anxiety, deep depression, simmering anger, mutual resentment, and a profound, corrosive sense of injustice directed at both the distant state government and sometimes, tragically, at their more fortunate neighbors. Community meetings convened in the days and weeks following Dr. Whalen's divisive announcement devolved frequently into chaotic, emotionally charged, often tearful confrontations. These weren't just directed between frustrated residents and defensive state officials, attempting to justify the limited scope of the evacuation plan with bureaucratic explanations and contested scientific interpretations. Increasingly, the anger and frustration spilled over between neighbors themselves, now cruelly divided by an invisible, arbitrary, yet life-altering line drawn on a map by distant authorities in Albany. It was precisely during one such tumultuous, highly charged public meeting, while directly confronting state health and environmental officials attempting to defend the rationale behind the limited evacuation zone, that Lois Gibbs, articulating the collective fury, desperation, and profound sense of betrayal felt by the hundreds of families effectively condemned to remain, delivered her famous, impassioned, widely reported accusation, her voice reportedly trembling with barely suppressed rage, yet resonating with unwavering maternal conviction. "You are murdering us. You are signing death certificates for our children." That raw, visceral accusation, hurled in the face of official authority, crystallized the LCHA's new, more radicalized, and strategically broadened focus. The initial hard-won victory of forcing the closure of the 99th Street Elementary School, once the primary, driving objective of Gibbs's personal campaign, now seemed, in the context of the pervasive neighborhood-wide contamination suggested by their own health survey, woefully, tragically insufficient. Similarly, the state's grudgingly offered partial evacuation and buyout plan for just the first two rings of homes was now universally perceived by the LCHA leadership and the majority of residents not as a genuine good faith solution, but rather as a cynical, inadequate containment strategy, a calculated attempt perhaps to placate the most vocal residents, manage the negative media attention, and strictly limit the state's potentially enormous financial liability, all while effectively sacrificing the health and well-being of the majority of the Love Canal community residing just beyond the arbitrary boundary. The battle lines, previously somewhat fluid, were now irrevocably, starkly drawn. The LCHA, under Lois Gibbs's increasingly confident, strategically astute, and remarkably media-savvy leadership, shifted its core, non-negotiable demand. No longer willing to accept partial measures or geographically limited solutions, they now demanded nothing less than total evacuation and fair market value buyout eligibility for all families residing within the broadly defined Love Canal neighborhood who wished to leave, regardless of their specific street address, their precise distance from the canal boundary, or the state's contested interpretation of localized risk assessments, and recognizing acutely the immense unprecedented financial burden such a comprehensive relocation would entail, likely hundreds of millions of dollars, they knew instinctively that the primary focus of their fight had to escalate significantly beyond the state capital in Albany. They needed to directly compel the federal government in Washington, D.C. to intervene decisively, to declare a broader federal disaster area encompassing the entire affected community, and crucially, to provide the substantial federal funding necessary to facilitate a complete, just, and permanent community relocation. Consequently, the fight for Love Canal escalated dramatically in intensity, national visibility, and tactical sophistication throughout the remainder of 1978, and particularly through 1979. The Love Canal Homeowners Association, still operating primarily out of Lois Gibbs's increasingly cramped and chaotic living room, transformed itself with astonishing speed from a localized, single-issue protest group into a remarkably effective, nationally recognized, and politically influential engine of grassroots environmental activism. They intuitively, then quite strategically, learned how to harness the rapidly growing power of the national media, particularly the network television news broadcasts, which were increasingly drawn to the compelling, visually dramatic David and Goliath narrative unfolding in Niagara Falls. They deliberately cultivated relationships with sympathetic local and, critically, national reporters, feeding them a constant stream of powerful human interest stories, highlighting the suffering of affected families, providing facilitated access for interviews, and filming within contaminated homes, meticulously documenting new instances of illness or environmental problems, and ensuring a steady, relentless drumbeat of negative coverage that kept Love Canal firmly fixed in the national headlines and on the political agenda. They also became masters of staging visually arresting, emotionally potent protest actions designed specifically to capture the attention of television cameras, events meticulously crafted to translate complex scientific arguments about parts per billion contamination levels into simple, universally understandable, powerful emotional appeals centered on endangered children and betrayed families. Their tactics were consistently relentless, remarkably creative given their limited resources, often deeply personal and emotionally charged, and always strategically designed to maximize public sympathy, while simultaneously applying unbearable political pressure on elected officials at both the state and federal levels. They organized somber candlelit prayer vigils held regularly, often in inclement weather, outside the stark chain-link fence now surrounding the empty, silent 99th Street Elementary School, serving as a constant, poignant visual reminder to the public of the hundreds of children still living just blocks away in potentially equally contaminated homes. They staged provocative, gut-wrenching mock funerals, complete with small, child-sized coffins carried through the streets, explicitly symbolizing the children they passionately believed would inevitably die from chronic chemical exposure if the government continued to delay decisive action and failed to approve a full evacuation. In one particularly dramatic, headline-grabbing, and politically risky action that generated significant statewide attention and considerable controversy, a large contingent of LCHA members traveled en masse by bus to the state capitol in Albany. They carried a symbolic child's coffin directly into the opulent, marble-lined reception area of Governor Hugh Carey's executive office suite, staging an impromptu sit-in and refusing to leave until granted an immediate, unscheduled meeting with the governor himself, a bold act of political theater designed to bypass bureaucratic channels and force a direct confrontation. Simultaneously, they became surprisingly adept, largely through trial and error and the guidance of pro bono advisors, at navigating the complex, often intimidating corridors of power in both Albany and Washington, D.C. They learned quickly the often arcane language of environmental legislation, public health regulations, appropriations processes, and effective political negotiation. They organized multiple arduous bus trips, funded by donations and bake sales, enabling ordinary residents, housewives, chemical plant workers, retirees, many of whom had never engaged in any form of political action before in their lives, to travel hundreds of miles to directly confront state legislators, high-ranking EPA administrators, congressional representatives, and even White House officials with their deeply personal stories of illness, fear, and betrayal, demanding immediate, concrete action. They learned to identify potential political allies, cultivate relationships with sympathetic staffers, and strategically target intransigent officials or recalcitrant agencies with focused negative publicity campaigns. Lois Gibbs, in particular, continued her remarkable personal evolution during this period, transforming rapidly from a self-described shy, politically naive housewife into a remarkably articulate, fiercely passionate, strategically shrewd, and exceptionally media-savvy national spokesperson for the environmental justice movement. She proved capable of holding her own, often exceeding expectations. Intense, high-stakes negotiations with governors, EPA chiefs, congressional committee chairs, and even senior advisors within the Carter White House. The LCHA, under her leadership, relentlessly, effectively framed the unfolding Love Canal crisis, not merely as a tragic, localized environmental contamination problem, affecting a few hundred unfortunate families in economically depressed upstate New York, but rather as a profound systemic national scandal, a terrifying, cautionary warning sign about the thousands upon thousands of other potential toxic waste dump sites lurking, often unmarked, unregulated, and dangerously close to residential areas, beneath communities, all across America. They argued forcefully, persuasively, that the federal government possessed not just a potential legal authority, but a profound moral obligation to intervene decisively, not only to rescue the residents of Love Canal, but also to establish national policies preventing similar tragedies from occurring elsewhere. While this intense political and public relations battle raged on multiple fronts, the crucial scientific front also remained highly contested, complex, and critically important throughout 1979 and into 1980. The LCHA leadership, particularly Lois Gibbs, intuitively understood that powerful personal anecdotes and emotional appeals alone, while essential for garnering media attention and public sympathy, wouldn't ultimately suffice to win the necessary governmental action, especially concerning the enormous financial commitment required for a total buyout. They needed credible, compelling scientific data to definitively counter the minimizing narratives being aggressively pushed by Hooker Chemical's corporate successor, Occidental Petroleum, and at times echoed by reluctant or budget-conscious government agencies seeking to contain the scope and cost of the rapidly escalating crisis. Occidental Petroleum, unsurprisingly, deployed its considerable financial resources to fund its own extensive scientific studies, often conducted by well-compensated environmental consulting firms. These industry-funded studies consistently, predictably downplayed the demonstrable extent of the off-site chemical migration, aggressively challenged the epidemiological links suggested by the LCHA between specific chemical exposures and the observed clusters of health problems, and repeatedly emphasized Hooker's technical compliance with the profoundly inadequate waste disposal standards and lack of specific regulations prevalent during the 1940s and 50s. Furthermore, Occidental's legal team persistently pointed to the infamous $1 land sale deed and its explicit liability waiver clause as supposed proof that all legal and financial responsibility for any subsequent problems lay solely and entirely with the Niagara Falls School Board, and by extension, the subsequent homeowners themselves. Frustratingly for the residents, even some of the initial studies commissioned by state and federal agencies seemed at times designed or interpreted in ways that produced ambiguous or inconclusive results, further muddying the waters and delaying decisive action. Methodologies employed were sometimes criticized by independent scientists as flawed or insufficient to detect the true extent of the problem. Perhaps sample sizes were statistically too small to achieve significance. Testing protocols lacked sensitivity for certain key chemicals like dioxin. Appropriate control groups were difficult to establish in the affected population, or official conclusions were deliberately worded with excessive caution, avoiding definitive statements of causation that could trigger greater governmental liability. Exasperated by these perceived limitations, delays, and potential obfuscations within the official scientific process, the LCHA, often aided financially by small emergency grants from environmental foundations or through pro bono assistance from concerned independent scientists, they actively recruited, took the extraordinary step of commissioning their own independent health and environmental studies. These studies, frequently conducted by sympathetic academic researchers like Dr. Beverly Pagan, a cancer researcher from the nearby Roswell Park Memorial Institute, who became a key scientific ally for the residents, employed different methodologies, sometimes focusing intensely on anecdotal evidence patterns or utilizing innovative biological markers. While occasionally criticized for methodological rigor by established government agencies, these independent, LCHA-sponsored studies consistently painted a far more alarming, statistically significant picture. They repeatedly identified dramatic increases in miscarriage rates, documented statistically improbable clusters of specific birth defects, and suggested elevated rates of certain types of cancers within the Love Canal population, particularly demonstrating strong geographical correlations between illness clusters and proximity to the canal itself, and crucially, the newly identified underground swale migration pathways. The ensuing scientific debate devolved, predictably and tragically for the residents seeking clarity, into a confusing, often contradictory and highly technical war of the experts, played out acrimoniously in scientific journals, government reports, legal depositions, and sensationalized media accounts. This scientific uncertainty, much of it arguably manufactured or exacerbated by industry tactics, further traumatized residents who desperately sought clear, unambiguous answers about the risks they faced and the safety of their homes. However, amidst this deliberately generated scientific noise and regulatory confusion, one specific terrifying discovery emerged definitively in late 1978 and gained widespread confirmation through subsequent, more targeted testing in early 1979. A discovery that dramatically escalated the perceived level of risk beyond any reasonable debate and ultimately proved pivotal in compelling decisive federal intervention. State environmental investigators, conducting more extensive follow-up soil sampling and testing of sump pump residues in areas slightly further removed from the immediate canal boundary, detected, confirmed, and quantified the unmistakable chemical signature of TCDD, the most acutely toxic form of the chemical family known collectively as dioxins. Dioxin, specifically the 2,3,7,8-TCDD isomer identified at Love Canal, wasn't just another industrial chemical. It occupied a unique category of environmental poisons, primarily generated as an unwanted, trace but extraordinarily potent contaminant during the manufacture of certain chlorine-based herbicides and industrial chemicals derived from trichlorophenol. TCDD was known even in the 1970s, primarily through horrific industrial accidents like the Seveso disaster in Italy and emerging studies on exposed Vietnam veterans, to be one of the most acutely toxic synthetic poisons ever created by humankind. Its biological potency is measured not in the familiar parts per million or even parts per billion, but often in parts per trillion. It was scientifically recognized as an extremely powerful animal carcinogen and strongly suspected human carcinogen. It was definitively known to be a potent teratogen capable of causing severe complex birth defects and reproductive failures, even at vanishingly small exposure levels. Furthermore, it was understood to be a powerful disruptor of the endocrine and immune systems, implicated in a wide array of debilitating long-term health problems, including chloracne, liver damage, diabetes, and neurological disorders. Critically, dioxin is also exceptionally persistent in the environment, resisting natural degradation and tending to bioaccumulate in fatty tissues, meaning its effects could linger for decades. Its confirmed presence, therefore, even in the trace amounts initially detected within the soil and potentially migrating into homes within a residential neighborhood, particularly one surrounding an elementary school, represented an environmental health emergency of the absolute highest order, transcending typical contamination scenarios. The discovery of dioxin fundamentally, irrevocably changed the risk assessment calculus for Love Canal. It elevated the situation from a serious, but perhaps arguably manageable local toxic waste problem involving common industrial solvents into a potential national public health catastrophe, demanding immediate, unreserved federal attention and resources. The Environmental Protection Agency, the relatively young federal agency established by President Nixon in 1970, with a broad statutory mandate to protect human health and the environment from precisely such threats, could no longer plausibly treat Love Canal as primarily a New York State issue to be managed locally. The unambiguous identification of dioxin within a residential community effectively forced the EPA's direct, large-scale, and ultimately decisive involvement in the crisis. Yet, even with the EPA's formal high-profile entry onto the scene, bringing with it significant federal resources, scientific expertise, and regulatory authority, the path towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution for the besieged residents of Love Canal remained agonizingly slow, frustratingly complex, and fraught with continued bureaucratic inertia, jurisdictional squabbles between state and federal agencies, intense political calculation regarding costs and precedents, and persistent, often industry-fueled, scientific debate regarding the precise extent of the contamination and the specific health risks involved. More extensive, time-consuming environmental studies were commissioned by the EPA to fully delineate the boundaries of the chemical plume migrating outwards from the canal. Multiple interagency task forces were formed, involving representatives from the EPA, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, New York State agencies, and even the White House, tasked with assessing the situation, evaluating remedial options, and coordinating the governmental response. Committees deliberated endlessly. Voluminous reports were drafted, subjected to lengthy peer review processes, revised based on conflicting data or political feedback, often delaying concrete action for months, even years. Meanwhile, hundreds of families remained trapped in the increasingly stigmatized Love Canal neighborhood, living daily with the crushing psychological burden of fear and uncertainty. They continued to breathe air they suspected was toxic, drink water they feared was contaminated, watch their children suffer from unexplained illnesses they attributed to the buried waste, unable to sell their homes now universally recognized as worthless, their lives effectively suspended, held hostage, in a state of seemingly perpetual toxic limbo. The government, it seemed to many desperate, angry residents, was meticulously, endlessly studying the raging fire while the house burned down around them, prioritizing bureaucratic process and cost containment over immediate human need. This simmering, deeply rooted frustration and profound sense of betrayal within the Love Canal community finally reached an absolute explosive boiling point in the spring of 1980. The specific catalyst was the apparently premature, potentially unauthorized leak to the press of highly sensitive preliminary results from a pilot chromosome study conducted by the EPA. This controversial study involved analyzing blood samples collected from a relatively small, self-selected group of Love Canal residents, looking for potential evidence of chromosome breakage, aberrations, or other genetic abnormalities that might indicate cellular damage caused by exposure to mutagenic chemicals known to be present in the landfill waste. According to the leaked reports, the preliminary findings suggested that some residents might exhibit such chromosomal abnormalities at a rate statistically higher than expected when compared to a small control population, hinting terrifyingly at the possibility of irreversible genetic damage, harm potentially extending not just to the exposed individuals, but to their future generations. Although the study was explicitly labeled preliminary, involved a small sample size, employed methodologies that were scientifically debated even at the time, and its conclusions were deliberately couched in tentative, cautious language, the mere suggestion of potential, inheritable genetic damage leaked into the already intensely fearful and suspicious atmosphere of Love Canal ignited an immediate firestorm of panic, outrage, and renewed demands for action. Residents felt profoundly violated, fearing they were being treated not as citizens needing rescue but as unwitting human guinea pigs in a vast, uncontrolled, multi-generational toxicological experiment, their very DNA potentially scarred by hookers' waste and government inaction. The LCHA office was instantly inundated with calls from terrified residents, demanding clarification, demanding answers, demanding immediate evacuation. The organization's leadership immediately escalated their demands to state and federal officials, insisting on full disclosure of the study's findings, a clear explanation of its potential implications for their long-term health and reproductive futures, and crucially, renewed insistence on immediate, decisive action, namely, a federally funded relocation of everyone from the contaminated area, in a fateful, ultimately disastrous attempt to quell the rapidly escalating panic, manage the unfolding public relations crisis, and perhaps correct the interpretation of the leaked preliminary data. The White House, under President Jimmy Carter, decided to dispatch 2 mid-level EPA officials directly to Love Canal. Their assigned, unenviable mission: meet face-to-face with LCHA leaders and concerned community members, carefully explain the preliminary, inherently inconclusive nature of the chromosome study, strongly downplay any immediate cause for alarm, and essentially attempt to calm the volatile situation through bureaucratic reassurance and scientific nuance. 1980. However spontaneous and desperate, proved strategically decisive. The image of federal officials held captive by terrified citizens, broadcast nationwide, created an intolerable political situation for the Carter administration. It shattered the carefully constructed narrative of containment and control that state and federal agencies had attempted to maintain. President Jimmy Carter, facing an election year and immense public pressure fueled by relentless media coverage, acted. His second federal emergency declaration for Love Canal, signed in October 1980, finally authorized the federal funds necessary for the permanent relocation of all families residing within the expanded 10-square-block emergency zone who wished to leave. Over 900 families were now eligible for a government buyout. It was an unprecedented, monumental victory for Lois Gibbs and the LCHA, a stunning testament to the power of sustained grassroots activism against seemingly insurmountable odds. The victory, however celebrated, remained deeply bittersweet. Residents had fought not to save their cherished homes and neighborhood, but to gain the fundamental right to abandon them, to flee the invisible poison that had permeated their lives. The government buyout checks, while providing the crucial means of escape, often reflected pre-crisis property values or were insufficient to fully compensate families for their financial losses, let alone the profound emotional toll, the destruction of their close-knit community fabric, or the persistent, gnawing fears about the long-term health consequences of their exposure. The exodus from Love Canal commenced throughout 1980 and 1981, transforming the once vibrant neighborhood into an eerie tableau of suburban decay. Moving trucks became a daily, mournful sight on the increasingly deserted streets. Families packed the remnants of lives abruptly, traumatically interrupted, leaving behind houses filled with cherished memories now irrevocably tainted by the invisible threat lurking beneath the soil and seeping through the walls. Neighbors who had forged deep bonds through shared struggle scattered across the region and the country, seeking not just new houses but new beginnings, attempting, often unsuccessfully, to outrun the toxic legacy they carried physically within their bodies and psychologically within their minds. Yet the profound impact of the Love Canal disaster extended far beyond the chain-link fences eventually erected around the abandoned neighborhood in Niagara Falls. The harrowing images relentlessly broadcast nightly on national television news, the unsettling sight of black chemical sludge oozing into basements, the heartbreaking interviews with parents describing their children's inexplicable severe illnesses, the raw fury of housewives confronting seemingly indifferent government officials struck a deep, resonant chord across the entire nation. It forced a long overdue national reckoning with a previously ignored, deeply uncomfortable reality. Love Canal, while perhaps extreme in its concentration and proximity to residents, was almost certainly not an isolated incident. Decades of largely unregulated industrial activity, driven by post-war economic expansion, had potentially created thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of similar hazardous toxic waste dump sites, scattered invisibly across the American landscape, often located dangerously close to residential areas, their contents frequently unknown or unrecorded, their potential dangers entirely unassessed. A chilling fear rippled through communities nationwide. Could my town, my neighborhood, be the next Love Canal? This powerful groundswell of public fear, environmental concern, and political pressure, directly and undeniably galvanized by the unfolding, highly publicized Love Canal crisis, led to remarkably swift and historically landmark legislative action in Washington, D.C. In the final, productive weeks of the Carter administration, in December 1980, the United States Congress passed, with broad bipartisan support, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, universally known by its acronym CERCLA, or more commonly and enduringly, simply as Superfund. Superfund was a truly revolutionary, albeit imperfect, piece of environmental legislation. For the very first time, it granted the federal government, primarily through the Environmental Protection Agency, broad legal authority, and crucially, established a dedicated funding mechanism to systematically identify, scientifically investigate, prioritize based on risk, and compel the cleanup of the nation's most hazardous abandoned or uncontrolled waste sites. Critically, Superfund enshrined in federal law the powerful legal principle of strict, joint and several liability. This meant that any party identified as having contributed any amount of hazardous waste to a specific site could potentially be held legally and financially responsible for the entire, often astronomical, cost of the site's cleanup, regardless of whether their actions were legal, at the time of disposal, and regardless of the actions of other contributing parties. This potent polluter pays principal, though constantly challenged, litigated, and sometimes diluted over the subsequent decades by powerful industry lobbying efforts, represented a fundamental seismic shift in the legal landscape of environmental accountability in America. Love Canal wasn't just a local tragedy, memorialized in headlines. It served as the direct, undeniable catalyst, the political crucible for the creation of the primary, overarching legal and financial tool America still utilizes today, however imperfectly, to confront its vast, complex, and dangerous toxic industrial past. Lois Gibbs and the determined residents of the LCHA hadn't just managed to save their own families from a poisoned environment. They had inadvertently, through their courageous struggle, launched a national environmental cleanup effort of unprecedented scale. While the legislative victory of Superfund resonated nationally, the immediate aftermath for Love Canal itself involved a protracted, technically complex, enormously expensive, and often deeply controversial cleanup and containment process stretching over decades. Under the newly established Superfund authority, extensive, multi-phase remediation efforts commenced. The most heavily contaminated areas, including the original canal bed itself and the innermost ring of demolished homes, underwent significant excavation, removing thousands of tons of hazardous soil and leaking drums for disposal in more secure, specially designed hazardous waste landfills elsewhere. A massive, state-of-the-art containment system was meticulously constructed around the core dump site, featuring thick, multi-layered clay and synthetic caps designed to prevent rainwater infiltration, extensive underground barrier walls intended to block lateral groundwater migration, and sophisticated networks of wells and trenches designed to collect contaminated groundwater for ongoing pumping and on-site treatment. Contaminated soil from hundreds of residential yards further out and sediments from nearby creeks like Black Creek and Bergholz Creek were painstakingly removed and replaced with clean fill. The abandoned houses located within the most toxic inner zones were systematically demolished, erasing the physical remnants of the neighborhood closest to the source. It was a monumental, unprecedented engineering undertaking, costing hundreds of millions of dollars and requiring continuous monitoring and maintenance that persists even to this day. Occidental Petroleum, the corporate successor to Hooker Chemical, engaged in lengthy, complex, and often acrimonious legal battles throughout the 1980s and 90s, aggressively attempting to minimize its financial responsibility by challenging scientific findings, disputing liability interpretations, and suing other potentially responsible parties, including the city of Niagara Falls and the school board. Ultimately, however, through a series of landmark court decisions and negotiated settlements reached under the powerful enforcement provisions of Superfund, Occidental was eventually compelled to pay a substantial portion of the massive cleanup costs, figures often cited as exceeding $200 million over the long term. Nevertheless, many environmental advocates and former residents continue to argue vehemently that this amount, while significant, represented only a fraction of the true multi-generational environmental and human health damages inflicted by Hooker's decades of negligent waste disposal practices, and paled in comparison to the billions in profits generated over the years by the very chemical production processes that created the toxic legacy. Numerous separate class action and individual lawsuits filed by thousands of former Love Canal residents against Occidental Petroleum resulted, over many years, in complex, often confidential settlements. These provided some measure of financial compensation, primarily for property loss, and in some cases for alleged health injuries. However, the settlement amounts were frequently criticized as inadequate, particularly given the lifetime health risks and chronic illnesses many families continued to face, and the immense difficulty inherent in toxic tort litigation of proving direct, unequivocal legal causation between specific historical chemical exposures and individual illnesses manifesting years or even decades later. The American dream: a house, a yard, a safe school for your children. At Love Canal, that dream, sold so convincingly, was built literally upon a foundation of toxic betrayal, hooker chemical, prioritizing profit and expediency, buried nearly 22,000 tons of its deadliest waste, and then walked away for a single dollar, leaving hundreds of unsuspecting families to discover, through illness and heartbreak decades later, that their homes, their health, their very lives were profoundly contaminated by corporate negligence, operating in plain sight. Yet, it is crucial to remember that from this devastating true crime against an entire community emerged an equally powerful, enduring story of resistance, a narrative led by ordinary citizens, particularly the determined mothers of Love Canal, who refused to be silenced, who educated themselves, organized relentlessly, fought tirelessly for justice against overwhelming odds, and whose courageous battle ultimately ignited a national movement, forever changing America's approach to environmental accountability. Here at Plain Sight Docs, we remain firmly committed to unearthing and meticulously examining these critical, often uncomfortable stories, complex narratives of institutional failure, profound corporate malfeasance, individual courage, and the often long struggle for community survival and justice. We believe deeply that understanding precisely how these betrayals happen, how powerful entities manage to operate with impunity, often for decades, is the essential first step toward recognizing the warning signs today and actively preventing such tragedies from recurring in other communities. If you found this in-depth investigation illuminating, if these essential true stories of communities fighting for their very survival resonate with you, and you believe they must continue to be told, please take a brief moment to show your support by liking this video. Your simple engagement is a powerful signal, not just to us but to the wider platform, that uncovering these often buried histories and demanding accountability genuinely matters. What specific aspect of the Love Canal cover-up, the residents' courageous fight for justice, or the long-term environmental legacy impacted you the most profoundly? Do you know of similar, perhaps less famous, environmental battles or instances of corporate negligence happening in communities today that deserve wider attention? Share your invaluable thoughts, your personal reflections, your critical insights, and crucially, your important suggestions for future investigations that Plain Sight Docs should undertake in the comments section below. Your active input and shared knowledge directly shape the future direction and impact of this channel. And finally, to guarantee you are among the very first notified the moment we release our next comprehensive documentary, continuing our mission to unearth the difficult truths that powerful forces often strive diligently to keep buried, please subscribe to Plain Sight Docs and make absolutely certain you click that vital notification bell. Your viewership and engagement directly fuel our ability to continue this critical work. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay vigilant,